I'm Kenneth Welsh. Welcome to Northern Mysteries. To hear the skeptics talk, you'd think that UFOs only appear in remote rural areas and that witnesses are incapable of telling the difference between the planet Venus and an alien spaceship. That is far from reality. Many UFOs are sighted over large cities. Witnesses include doctors, astronomers, aircraft pilots, and police officers, as was the case for the UFO sighting over the Bonaventure Hotel in Montreal in 1990.
It was 9:10 p.m. on November 7th, 1990, as a man sped down Mansfield Street in Montreal. He could barely keep his eyes off the downtown Montreal skyline, since something highly unusual was happening in the sky overhead. He stopped at the Hilton Bonaventure Hotel, crossed the lobby, and headed straight for the elevators. This downtown hotel was known for its rooftop pool, which was open all year round. But that November night, there were more onlookers than swimmers on the roof. There were more than 30 people standing about, their eyes riveted on a strange flying object, hovering in the sky above their heads. The oval-shaped craft was made of dark, polished metal. All around it were amber lights casting yellow and green beams through the clouds. Feverish with excitement, the man placed his camera on something to support it, then took a few pictures. Marcel Laroche, a reporter for the Montreal daily newspaper La Presse, had no idea that his photos would become the key evidence for one of the most surprising UFO sightings in the history of Canada.
Un phénomène plutôt étrange a été observé hier soir dans le ciel de Montréal. La police de la CUM et la GRC sont même venus sur les lieux à la demande de plusieurs témoins qui se trouvaient à la piscine du toit de l'hôtel Bonaventure. Voici ce qui s'est passé. Selon le rapport rédigé par la GRC, entre 2 et 5 lumières et un faisceau lumineux quasi stationnaire ont été aperçus dans le ciel à compter de 20 heures.
I'm convinced that I saw something that wasn't made by any inhabitant of this planet. There's no doubt in my mind it came from somewhere else than Earth. Even now, 15 years later, I'm just as convinced as I was back then.
That night, at around 7 p.m., swimmers at the Hilton Bonaventure noticed a large flying object with 7 or 8 amber lights. The object was totally silent and moving slowly from the stock market building to the hotel. Some of the onlookers were reminded of the UFOs that appeared in Steven Spielberg's film Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Intrigued, they notified the hotel management. Soon the rooftop was teeming with activity. At around 8 p.m., the hotel management called the Montreal police, who sent a patrol car to investigate. Officer François Lippé arrived on the scene a few minutes later. Like all of the other witnesses on the roof, he could definitely see the object. It was no longer moving and had been visible for close to an hour.
Around 7:30 p.m., one of my men calls me at my desk. and asks me if I could come to the scene because he thought something pretty special was going on. He had been called to the scene in response to a complaint or something, but realized that it was something rather unusual. So I went, and I saw for myself that the information my officer had given me over the phone was correct.
Thinking that he could get some answers, Officer Lippé contacted the air traffic controllers at the Dorval and Mirabel airports. Unfortunately, the radars at both airports were not picking up anything other than regular air traffic.
It was extremely dark. It was really difficult to estimate how high it was. We were sure it must have been a couple thousand feet, but we couldn't be any more exact than that. On the phone, the air traffic controller told me that on the radar screen, they currently had a cargo plane on final approach over the downtown area. At that moment, I was on a cell phone outside, and I saw the plane fly over us, but it flew underneath the object. And so I asked him, I said, "What altitude is your plane at?" And he says, "A couple of 100 feet above 6,000. And I said, "Is there anything else above it?" And he says, "I have nothing." There was nothing else on the radar except for the cargo plane.
If the civil aviation radars weren't picking it up, perhaps the ones at the Saint-Hubert military base were.
At that size, you better be sure we would see it.
But by the end of their conversation, Officer Masson was convinced that the controller was hiding something from him.
À ce moment-là, il y avait le mille de la Gauchetière qui était en construction, qui avait déjà, lui, ses tours, puis tout le système là, de grues pour monter les marchandises. Lui, il y avait beaucoup de grosses lumières blanches là, pour éclairer le chantier de construction.
Officer Masson ordered that the spotlights be turned off.
They turned all the floodlights off, but the object just stayed there. It didn't change. It was no reflection. I was getting more and more convinced that it really was something metallic up there. It was enormous. Then I thought of calling the RCMP. Back in those days, their office was on Dorchester Street in Westmount.
Since sky traffic falls under federal jurisdiction, the RCMP has a procedure that it follows for reports of UFO sightings. A federal officer was therefore sent to the hotel immediately.
I contacted the airport, the military. I talked to the colonel in charge of Saint-Hubert military operations, and I was told that there was no Canadian military operation going on. I also confirmed with Dorval and Mirabel if they had anything on radar, and they answered in the negative.
The RCMP officer called the Army. He probably had some access code or something like that. At any rate, they listened to him. Then, in the time it takes for an F-18 to get to Place Bonaventure from Bagotville, about 14, 15, 16 minutes, it was on the scene. We didn't see it, but we heard it. We were sure it was up there, and he told me it had taken pictures.
At around 8:45 p.m., the copy desk chief at the Montreal daily newspaper La Presse suggested to Marcel Laroche that he stop by the Hilton Bonaventure before his shift ended. Meanwhile, RCMP officer Luc Morin was contacting Environment Canada, who told him that the cloud covering, through which they could see the ship, was about 1,200 to 1,500 meters thick.
It was gigantic, considering it was somewhere around 8,000 or 10,000 feet up. It was still enormous up there in the sky, and it was really high up. Just to help the viewers get an idea of it, if it had had to land on some parking lot, like the big parking lots at suburban malls, for example, I don't think the lot would be big enough for this thing to land. It was that big.
At around 10:30, the object began moving east, away from the city. Pierre Comartin also saw the object on his way back home at around 11 p.m.
I could see something, some kind of a flying object on top of the Olympic Tower right there, which is very well lit. And that thing was basically going east as I was. From here on, I figured out that this thing must have been pretty big, pretty darn big, because there was no blimp. I can't define the type of object. I can't. I've never seen anything like that.
Comartin thought he was seeing a promotional helicopter with powerful spotlights.
The lighting was definitely very strong. It was definitely big. I could hear from here, and this is where I heard the sound of the object. It was like some kind of a neat purring sound. Just a little rhythmic purring. And the way this thing was moving was very strange because it was very static. It could be very static, wouldn't budge. And then it would like glide and go down very fast.
The photos taken by Marcel Laroche that night were sent to Dr. Richard Haynes, an optical specialist at the NASA Ames laboratory. After analyzing Laroche's negatives, Dr. Haynes came to the conclusion that the lights were not just reflections. They were indeed being projected from a three-dimensional physical object. It was also reported that the ship was flying at an altitude varying between 1,060 and 2,700 meters, and that its diameter was approximately 540 meters across, the length of 5 football fields. The study cast aside any theories regarding the aurora borealis or other astronomical phenomena. Unfortunately, it is impossible to find out the results of the reconnaissance flights made by the Canadian Forces F-18s. What's more, all reports of the sighting by municipal police officers and RCMP officers became officially inaccessible as of the next day. On November 8th, 2 officers from NORAD, the agency responsible for protecting North American airspace, were instructed to collect all findings relating to this apparition in the Montreal sky. With no further explanation, one of the most impressive UFO sightings in Canada came to an end.
Although the Montreal UFO, as it was dubbed by the media, was quite the sight, it was not unique. In the early 1990s, several UFO sightings were reported over Brussels, a city with a population of 1 million, and over Mexico City, which has a population of 20 million. In all of these cases, the mystery remains. Are we being visited by spaceships from another world? When it comes to UFOs, we often get the impression that the best stories come from the United States. But if we look in the National Archives of Canada, where reports of sightings are stockpiled, we find an interesting story that happened close to 40 years ago in Shag Harbor, Nova Scotia. On October 4th, 1967, the crew aboard Air Canada Flight 305, bound for Newfoundland, saw a group of bright objects flying at 12,000 feet. Suddenly, 2 explosions broke up the formation, and one of the objects headed down toward Nova Scotia. What happened next remains a puzzle to this day. At around 11 p.m. on October 4th, 1967,
Laurie Wickens and a few friends were driving towards the small town of Shag Harbor, Nova Scotia. Suddenly, Wickens pointed to an object in the sky that seemed to be headed directly for the Atlantic Ocean. Curious, they decided to drive to the headland where the Irish moss plant was located to get a better glimpse of the object. When they arrived, Wickens noticed that the craft was rapidly losing altitude. It was now about 300 meters from the shore. The amber lights around it were spinning, like a beacon sending a signal. The craft touched down on the waves. Thinking that it might be an aircraft in distress, Wickens decided to go to Woods Harbor, where he could notify the RCMP detachment in Barrington Passage.
In 1967, there were over 300 UFO sightings reported to the Canadian military. At that time, the RCAF was the official investigating body, and they ordered the underwater search here. And to put that in perspective, in 1967, there were 9 cases in Canada that received an official government investigation, Shag Harbor being the best known.
Corporal Victor Werbicki took the call that came into the RCMP office that night. Despite Wickens' pleas, Werbicki was unsure of how to proceed. What if it was nothing more than a late-night prank?
The RCMP car went up by. The lights and sirens are going, and we thought that a plane had crashed. And that's the first thing that we thought it was a plane going down. And so we jumped in the car, followed the RCMP to what we call the Irish Moss Plant.
Just before midnight, Officer Werbicki arrived at the Irish Moss Plant. Wickens hadn't been lying to him. Something was indeed floating at the water's surface, but he wasn't sure how much longer it would remain there.
We went up to the Irish Moss Plant. When we got there, the police car was there. We stood watching the light for probably 4 or 5 minutes, and then the light went out. Whether the light went under the ocean, under the water, or where it went, we don't know.
This thing appeared to either submerge under its own power or sunk. At this point, nobody was thinking UFO. They were thinking that an airplane had crashed in the harbor, and they were concerned about survivors or even the fact that there might be some bodies out there. So the RCMP enlisted the aid of 2 fishing boats in the area. They went out on the water to see if they could find survivors or wreckage or whatever.
At the request of the RCMP, Bradford Shang and Lawrence Smith, 2 local fishermen, went to the impact site. For close to an hour, the 2 men combed the harbor, but they didn't find anything. No wreckage, no survivors. At around 12:45 a.m., the Coast Guard told the 2 fishermen that no commercial or private aircraft had been reported missing. In the hours that followed, 6 other fishing boats joined theirs, but the search was in vain. The object that had fallen into the waters off Shag Harbor had apparently not left any debris. However, when the searchers approached the point where the object had landed, they found a trail of thick yellow foam that gave off a strong stench of sulfur.
Stayed there all night until RCMP divers came up the next morning. And we were still out there. We stayed all day the next day, looking and hoping that we could find some debris or something on the water from whatever it was, and we didn't find nothing.
This search continued until Monday. It occurred Wednesday night. At that time, the search was terminated, and they claimed no results. They never denied the belief that a UFO had gone in the water, and they clearly called it that. They simply said that they had found nothing.
Despite the absence of physical proof, Canadian authorities took the matter seriously. The incident was even reported to the Colorado Project, a UFO study team sponsored by the American Air Force.
We have no doubt that radar saw these things. We can only go by anecdotal evidence and a process of association that they were and did. Something was indeed seen that night coming down over northern Canada towards Shag Harbor. But we can't prove it.
I think there's evidence that at some level there's evasion. I'm not one to buy into a great organized conspiracy, but there's often uneven release policies between the various agencies. It's a touchy subject, and you know, you have to wonder, I'll tell you. I sometimes think, you know, when the excuse of national security is used, that it's not so much national security but national insecurity. Some of these people have huge budgets, and they're responsible for the penetration of our skies and defense systems and oceans, and they don't like to say, we don't know.
The Shag Harbor incident was forgotten for the next quarter century. Then, in 1993, Chris Stiles, who had witnessed the event in 1967, decided to reopen an investigation into the matter with financial assistance from an American television network.
In 1995, Paramount Television's syndicated show Sightings funded an underwater search, and what it was I proposed to them doing a 4-day survey, which would include side-scan sonar, a sub-bottom profiler, magnetometer, and divers, to go over the initial impact site of the naval search. And to be honest, we found absolutely nothing unusual. But I'm not discouraged by that, because that actually tells us something, because in a case where there was so much corroboration and the actions of the military and the documentation, which is an extensive paper trail, says clearly they were certain that this was a UFO and that it was lost there, you have to ask, where did this 60-foot object go? This is shallow water. With this technology, there's not a trace, there's no trauma, no evidence whatsoever. It remains a great mystery.
35 years ago is a long time ago, but it happened just the same as last night. Nothing is erased from my mind. Everything that took place that night is still visible as it can be. I don't know, tell you the truth, what it was. Nobody will ever convince me that nothing landed on the water, because something did. The RCMP seen it, 12 to 15 other people seen it, along with my father and my uncle. And we know that something landed on the water. What it was, we don't know.
In 2001, Chris Stiles and Don Ledger, two UFO investigators from Nova Scotia, published a book called Dark Object that retraces the events that took place in Shag Harbor, which are unique in the history of Canada and remain unexplained to this day. When the unknown shakes a person's confidence, their imagination can run wild. But true mysteries that defy all explanation may be doorways to the fantastic realm of knowledge.
I'm Kenneth Welsh. You are watching Northern Mysteries. When it comes to lake and sea creatures, the skeptics are always asking, but where's the proof? In 1937, some fishermen from the Queen Charlotte Islands in British Columbia stumbled on just such proof. Over 70 years later, their discovery is still the subject of debate.
Let's go back to that busy day in July 1937 in Naden Harbor, a small fishing village to the far north of the Queen Charlotte Islands. Whalers were bringing in their catches to be cut into pieces and processed into household products. That day, the fishermen brought in a large sperm whale caught off the coast of Langara Island. As they cut open the belly, the workers stopped in amazement. Besides the usual assortment of half-eaten fish and mollusks, the men discovered a long eel-like animal, like nothing they'd ever seen before. It had barely been decomposed by the gastric juices, and its features were quite unique. Its body was like a huge eel, 3 meters long and 15 centimeters wide. Its head was shaped like a horse or a camel. The men were so surprised by this unknown animal that they decided to lay it out on a bench and take a picture of it. As they were doing this, a rumor was spreading amongst the boats at the port. They had discovered a Cadborosaurus, the mysterious sea serpent that lurked in the waters off the western coast of Canada. The belief that a sea monster inhabits the waters west of British Columbia is nothing new. Just such a creature is mentioned in many First Nation legends and is often seen in their artwork.
The Cadborosaurus extends back as far as native folklore. They have names for it such as Highest Chuckaluk or Hate-Lick. And there's even islands that are dedicated to what's known as the native people coming of age, where they have to witness the sea serpent. A very rich history with the Cadborosaurus and native culture.
Cadborosaurus is a name given to a very large, snake-like aquatic animal that occurs mainly in deep waters, both in the sea and the coastal waters, and also in large, deep lakes of North America and Western Europe.
This description corresponds exactly to what was seen by Major W.H. Langley and his wife on October 1st, 1933.
At the time you saw Caddy, where were you?
It's sailing off the point of Discovery Island.
In a small boat?
Small boat, yes, sailing around quietly.
This is Discovery Island out here, is it?
Yes, just off the point there.
Just off the point,
yes.
I see.
As they were sailing in Cadboro Bay near Victoria, they saw a large dark object emerge from the depths. The creature looked like a huge snake swimming at the surface of the water.
Did you feel scared or afraid?
No, I was just interested. Because it took my fancy that it wasn't anything we'd seen before.
And was it some time before you admitted having seen it?
No, I think that night, I think the paper telephoned.
So you had the courage of your convictions, and you felt that this was real?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It was something that neither of us had ever seen before.
When they told their story to the Victoria Daily Times, readers suggested naming the creature a Cadborosaurus, since it was spotted in Cadboro Bay.
Cadborosaurus exists only in the recent times, as far as we know. Nothing like it exists in the fossil record from any period. And it is cold-blooded. It lives in very cold water, which ranges in temperature from maybe 4 degrees to 15 degrees. And it has a long, slender body, which is not insulated like a whale, or it doesn't have heavy hair on it or a coat. So that type of body would freeze to death if it were warm-blooded. So we believe it's cold-blooded and doesn't have to breathe air and can stay down for a long time, and being cold-blooded doesn't require as much food.
Since the Langley sighting in 1933, there have been other sightings reported more recently.
In 2004, I was at a beach near my home with my youngest daughter. We were throwing rocks in the water, and out of the corner of my eye, something splashed in the water. I could see something caught my eye. There was some sort of creature, there was some animal in the water, and the animal was traveling up and down in the water. And, you know, I watched this animal for about 20 seconds, traveling quite fast along the top of the water, and then it went under the water, disappeared.
In recorded history, they have been known for about a little over 2 centuries. And the first one was recorded on the west coast of North America by one of the sailors in Captain Cook's crew. And he wrote down these observations, and we've seen them on an average of 3 times per year ever since that time.
Men have been able to navigate the seas for thousands of years, but we actually know very little about the creatures living in our oceans. The late Jacques-Yves Cousteau once said that we know more about the moon than we do about the oceans around us.
Science has usually ridiculed creatures like this, unknown animals, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, what have you. For Cabrosaurus, a very strange thing happened because there was 2 scientists that became extremely interested in this, Dr. Ed Bousfield and Dr. Paul LeBlanc. And these 2 actually wrote a few books on it and proposed that this animal be classified in science. And they received a lot of abuse from it. But I think most of science, I'd like to think most of science keeps an open door to these.
Unfortunately for scientists, practically nothing remains of the carcass that was found in the whale's belly in Naden Harbor.
The Naden Harbor carcass, we really don't know what happened to it. It was supposedly sent up to the Nanaimo Biological Station. Pieces of it were going to be sent to the university and to the museum in Victoria. A few years ago, Ed Bousfield uncovered that it actually spent a week in Bellevue submerged in a vat of acetone under the heading, "Come and see the baby sea serpent." We researched this, we tried to find pictures. The pieces that showed up in Victoria were not that of the head. They were pieces of the flippers, pieces of the body. So this was unfortunate, a terrible loss. And we can only hope that if this happens again, someone will recover the entire body. But we would like to know what happened to the head.
No one knows for sure exactly what happened to the carcass that was brought to Naden Harbor. Some claim the remains were buried in the Queen Charlotte Islands, but others claim that the carcass was shipped to the mainland. In any case, they lost all trace of what happened to it after that. For now, the only physical proof we have is a few photos taken 70 years ago of an unknown sea creature. Photos that reveal that doubt goes hand in hand with knowledge. We are fascinated with sea monsters. Authors have delighted us with tales of such creatures. For readers of Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Below the Sea, the most exciting moment had to be the battle between Captain Nemo and the giant squid. No doubt inspired by sailors' stories. Was Jules Verne's imaginary beast truly fictional?
September 1901. Captain S.F. Scott was rowing a lifeboat toward the Race Rocks lighthouse on the coast of Vancouver Island. From there, he would be able to guide his boat into a safe passageway to secure it. But the wind had died, and strong currents had carried him close to dangerous reefs. Scott was making good headway when an unexpected presence suddenly appeared on his path. His boat hit something head-on in the darkness, and the captain was thrown into the cold waters of the Pacific Ocean. The sailor resurfaced. Spotted his upturned boat and began swimming towards it. As Scott reached the boat, he slipped under it, grabbed the frame, and attempted to flip the boat right side up. Under the water, something was wrapping itself around his calf like an aggressive snake. Even before the creature had time to tighten its grip, Captain Scott understood the horror of the situation. A squid had wrapped itself around his leg, and judging by the size of the tentacle, it had to be at least 15 to 20 meters long. The squid attempted to drag its prey underwater, but Scott held onto the boat for dear life. S.F. Scott fought for nearly half an hour to save himself. Tired of this endless battle, the creature finally let go and disappeared into the depths, leaving the captain alone and exhausted. Scandinavian legends call it the Kraken, a squid so huge that its tentacles would be capable of grabbing an entire ship and pulling it down into the ocean depths.
Well, the story of the Kraken goes back for centuries, back from the early days of sailing vessels. Early sailors, of course, were very superstitious, and in historical accounts, creatures have purportedly been witnessed on the ocean, in the ocean, that early sailors and early vessel travelers couldn't explain. So certainly the story of the Kraken it was likely early stories of giant squid sightings and landings that these people have seen. And of course, when you have no basis for comparison, your fears and your mythology is certainly what writes your history.
For anyone who has ever read the Jules Verne novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, or seen the movie in which a kraken attacks Captain Nemo's ship, the Nautilus, the question that comes to mind is whether or not this legendary creature really exists.
First of all, I don't think that Jules Verne had any idea that this could possibly happen, but he was a novelist and he gets to make things up, so he could make that up. What happened on the basis largely of the movie is that people began to believe that the giant squid was a ship-attacking, man-eating monster. There's no real reason to make that assumption other than it's a big animal with a lot of long, sticky tentacles.
Up until the 19th century, science viewed the kraken as nothing more than a mythical creature, like the unicorn and the mermaid. Then, the discovery of huge carcasses, 7 to 10 meters long, sparked an interest in zoologists, and they began to study the legend of the kraken. Although these carcasses were far from the giant sizes described in kraken myths, scientists were nevertheless persuaded to believe in the existence of very large squids living in the ocean depths.
There is a creature that is a large squid that can get to be 40 or 50 feet long. That's from the tip of its tail to the end of its tentacles. That's how big they get. I'm not sure that such a squid could even lift its tentacles out of the water, let alone grab a ship or grab human beings. But because people see them floating on the surface, they imagine what it is capable of doing.
An incident in Newfoundland truly paved the way for the study of giant squids. In October 1873, Daniel Squires, Theophilus Picot, and his 12-year-old son Tom were fishing in Portico Cove. Suddenly, the men noticed a pale form floating just beneath the surface of the water.
They happen upon something in the water which they think is a shipwreck or something just floating in the water. They go over, row over, and they start poking at it, progging at it, and ended up that it's a giant squid that comes alive or comes awake at them and starts trying to haul the little boat down underwater.
Tom Tom Pickett grabbed his axe and began chopping at the squid's tentacles with all his might until 3 of the tentacles fell off.
The squid let go, went back down underwater, and you know, let go that ink, like I said, because he was frightened also, didn't know what struck it. And they rowed back then in their haste to try to get back to the wharf and trying to tell everybody, you know, about what had happened to him. Nobody believed them, and then they showed him the tentacles and at amazement, like, you know, what they had done. So they take the tentacles and they bring it back up into the shore, and they end up feeding one to a dog, which that's disappeared, and the other piece we're not totally sure where it went. But they had got a hold of somebody in St. John's who a couple of days later came down and took what was left of the tentacle and examined it.
This amputated tentacle was to become the first concrete proof of the existence of a whole new species of giant squid. Today, a century after young Tom Pickett's adventure, the giant squid has become acknowledged as a scientific reality. Unfortunately, studies to date have only been based on carcasses found on the coasts of Newfoundland and New Zealand. No one has been able to study the beast in its natural habitat or to film one. Although it has passed from legend to reality, the giant squid remains an enigma. Experts cannot even agree on its size.
Giant squid in general, the current theory is that they reach a maximum length of about 20 meters. If you research the literature, the scientific and the folk literature going back for centuries, you will find reports that claim these things are much larger. Some reports have actually put these things of over 100 feet long, which we have seen no physical evidence of specimens that large.
According to some rumors, giant squids are far larger than the 15 to 20 meters proposed by scientists. Fishermen claim to have seen giant sucker marks on the skin of sperm whales.
The stories of giant sucker marks on the skin of sperm whales are always utterly exaggerated. There is no record, none whatsoever, of sucker marks that are 6 inches in diameter or a foot in diameter or 18 inches in diameter. The biggest sucker marks ever found were 3 inches in diameter. That's this big, not this big.
The size of the creature is not the only point upon which experts disagree. They're still quite in the dark about its eating habits, lifespan, and way of life. And it still hasn't been established whether or not there are several varieties of giant squids.
Architeuthis for a long time has been considered the quintessential giant squid. In 1925, people found what turned out to be an even larger species. We don't know because they never found an adult. They found a juvenile that was as large or larger than some of the giant squid that we do know. But it's like the giant squid, it's probably not a dangerous animal. It probably feeds on fishes. In fact, the Mesonicoteuthis, which is called the colossal squid, probably feeds in the Antarctic, which is where it lives, probably feeds on Patagonian toothfish, a fish that gets to be 5 or 6 feet long. But they don't attack whales, no matter which they are. In fact, what we know most about either the colossal squid or the giant squid is from those specimens that whalers have found in the stomachs of sperm whales. So the sperm whale eats the giant squid, not vice versa.
Although they are not known for displaying aggressive behavior, giant squids have at times shown that they can be fierce predators. In March 1941, British personnel carrier Britannia was sunk by a German ship in the North Atlantic. Survivors climbed on the upside-down lifeboat, but it was too small, so some of the survivors had to remain in the water, clinging to the boat. Now and then they would shift positions, taking turns getting out of the cold water and resting on top of the boat. One night, they were approached by a giant squid. One of the men in the water found himself being wrapped in a tentacle. Then he was pulled from the boat and dragged down to the ocean depths. The squid then came back to the surface and attacked Lieutenant Cox. Curiously enough, this time the creature was less insistent. According to the survivors, the squid had to be about 15 meters long, judging by the length of its tentacles. In the 1970s, Canada became the leader in giant squid studies thanks to the late Dr. Frederick A. Aldrich at St. John's Memorial University in Newfoundland.
Frederick Aldrich was an American who came to Newfoundland to study marine biology. And while he was there, he became interested in bait squid, and after that, giant squid, after there was a report of a giant squid coming to shore in Newfoundland. Subsequently, he had collected and examined a total of 15 specimens and became the world's expert on the subject.
In 1988, the scientist raised a stir throughout Newfoundland when he invited all fishermen and riverside residents to report the discovery of any carcasses that looked like a squid or something that they could not identify.
Frederick Aldrich tried to collect some film footage in cooperation with the Canadian Navy using their submersible, the SDL-1, in 1988. That was an expedition which was sponsored in part by National Geographic Society from the United States. We were in the right location at the right time of year, but unfortunately the giant squid did not decide to show itself at the time.
Over the years, his research has given us the little knowledge that we have about these incredible deep-sea monsters. Is it possible that the legend of the Kraken was inspired by sailors who, like young Tom Pickett, found themselves face to face with a giant squid? Fed by fear and rumor, have these tales served to maintain myths of a fictional creature, or have they helped us to advance in our knowledge of oceans and the mysteries that lie hidden in their depths?
In his book, The Search for the Giant Squid, Richard Ellis writes that exploring the ocean depths would be pretty monotonous if it weren't for the prospect of running into one of these giant unknown animals. No doubt Jules Verne would agree with him.
When the unknown shakes a person's confidence, their imagination can run wild. But true mysteries that defy all explanation may be doorways to the fantastic realm of knowledge.
I'm Kenneth Welsh. Welcome to Northern Mysteries. Magic, rituals, sacrifices, sorcery. When most of us hear those words, a scene from a B-movie or an Aleister Crowley novel springs to mind. But when the residents of La Ronge, Saskatchewan hear these words, it's a case of déjà vu.
Early that afternoon, there was a stir at the community center in La Ronge, a town located on the bank of La Ronge Lake, about 220 kilometers north of Prince Albert. At the request of the RCMP, volunteers were gathered for a search operation. They were looking for Jonathan Thimpson. a 7-year-old boy who'd been missing since Saturday, July 8th. One of the volunteers was 14-year-old Sandy Charles, the last person who saw the Thimpson boy. He had told the authorities that on the afternoon of July 8th, Thimpson came to his house to play baseball. No one had heard from the young boy since. At around 7 p.m., the volunteers found the body of the Thimpson boy in the woods near Sandy Charles's house. At first, it looked like the Thimpson boy was sleeping, but as they got closer, the volunteers were horrified to discover that Jonathan had been murdered. Learning that his playmate had died, Sandy Charles went back home. As he walked in the door, Sandy Charles felt powerful and invulnerable, like a warlock. Where does belief end and insanity begin? For Sandy Charles, the line between the two no longer exists.
Sandy Charles was a 14-year-old boy, a relatively, up to that point anyway, a relatively normal young man. I did make inquiries with the police to try and find out if there were any hints as to whether or not there was something unusual or whether this could have been predicted or prevented. All we know is that up to this point in time, he appeared normal. His teachers had no idea that anything like this would ever happen. His mother had no idea that anything like this would have happened.
Over the first few days of July 1995, Sandy Charles was hatching a diabolical plot which consisted of sacrificing an unbaptized child, boiling some of his fat, and drinking it to gain the power to fly, like he had seen in the movie Warlock.
In my discussion with Sandy Charles, it became very clear to me that he had beliefs in the occult and in Satan, and you know, his desire to become a disciple of Satan when he was released upon the earth, to Sandy Charles' belief in 2000. The movie Warlock, I don't know if you can blame that on the murder. It obviously gave him some influence on how he carried out the crime, though.
On the morning of Saturday, July 8th, Sandy Charles told his 8-year-old friend William Martin about his evil plan. A few meters behind Sandy Charles's house lay a patch of woods, the perfect spot for such a sacrifice. The two boys hid a kitchen knife in the woods to use later for the ritual. All they had to do now was to lure a victim.
His criteria was that he was looking for a male, unbaptized virgin child. He selected Jonathan Timpson because he didn't believe that Jonathan had a father, and in his belief that without a father, that meant he was not baptized. So that's why he was looking for this particular boy. When he selected this boy, he invited him to play baseball.
Although the game started off in good fun, it soon turned into a nightmare for young Jonathan Thimpson. Sandy hit the ball into the woods near the spot where the knife was hidden and asked Jonathan to go get the ball. Once in the woods, Jonathan was stopped in his tracks by the two older boys. Sandy grabbed the knife and stabbed Jonathan. He finished off the job by hitting Jonathan in the head with a rock.
After Jonathan Timpson was killed, Sandy Charles returned to his house. He went into the kitchen and he took a pair of kitchen tongs and a knife and a soup can.
Then, with Martin's help, he dragged the boy 100 meters and dumped it in the bushes. Jonathan Thimpson's body wasn't found until 4 days later. The next day, the mother of the Thimpson boy, who thought her son was at a cousin's house, reported his disappearance to the authorities. Early in the evening of July 11th, the volunteers found the boy's body in the woods. The body had been mutilated. The next day, the teen and his 8-year-old accomplice were taken in for questioning. The two boys immediately admitted their involvement in Jonathan Thimpson's death. On July 12th, Sandy Charles and his 8-year-old accomplice were taken in for questioning. Sandy was charged for his involvement in the murder of Jonathan Thimpson. With a disconcerting calm, Sandy Charles described the crime in detail. How he had tricked the young boy into going into the woods, then slit his throat and sliced off long strips of skin.
He showed very little remorse. He was very straightforward in discussing the details and what his beliefs were with me, and did so for quite some time during a statement that was taken from Sandy Charles. He, I think, understood. He understood what he had done, but I don't think he felt any remorse or understood the consequences.
When Sandy Charles was arrested, he was very willing to speak to the police. And it was an unusual opportunity to speak to someone who, very shortly after their arrest, who had committed such a horrendous crime. One of the things that I was very concerned about right at the outset when I heard about this crime and the facts was the possibility that we were dealing with a situation where the issue of whether or not he was criminally responsible, in other words, whether or not he was insane, whether or not that was a live issue. And to that end, I did advise the RCMP to consult with an expert forensic psychiatrist immediately.
Having obtained the teens' confessions, the investigators were issued a warrant to search their homes. There they found the knife, some tongs, and a can containing the melted flesh of the young Thimpson boy.
The can of flesh was in the basement of the Sandy Charles residence in La Ronge. I located that while we were executing a search warrant. This was after Sandy had already been arrested for the crime. In speaking with Sandy Charles, I asked him what his intentions were with this can, and he advised of the reasoning why this flesh was collected, why it was placed into the can, and what the purpose of it was. But he advised me that he did not have any intention of actually going through with consuming any of this flesh.
Sandy Charles was 3 days past his 14th birthday. He was subsequently raised to adult court, and he was prosecuted for the murder of Jonathan Thimpson.
The young murderer's trial began in June 1996. If he was found guilty, he could be sentenced to life imprisonment, with no chance of parole for 5 to 10 years, the maximum sentence for such a case. The defense attorney tried to prove that Sandy Charles was not responsible for his actions when he killed Jonathan Thimpson. It was horror movies like the film Warlock that had warped the teen's mind. A difficult case to prove.
What can bring an individual to act out a fantasy stems from the fact that that individual didn't have a chance to develop the mechanisms to repress his drives, his aggressive or primitive pulsions. These kinds of drives are all found in very small children and have not yet been tamed in them. Their upbringing helps them to channel their drives and their energies, their anger, their tantrums, their distress, their sadness. Parents help their children to make sense of this brew of instinctual drives and teeming energy. Unfortunately, in certain circumstances, some children don't have all the ingredients necessary in their social life, their family life, for the development of mechanisms to repress and to channel their aggressive drives. They're primitive drives.
As he sat at the defense table, Sandy Charles, who had pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, seemed to be totally uninterested in what was happening to him. On more than one occasion, he yawned or pretended to be sleeping to show how bored he was.
The trial of Sandy Charles occurred in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Courtroom number 1 is a very large courtroom. It's the biggest courtroom in Saskatoon. Sandy Charles sat in the prisoner's box, and when the accused sits in the prisoner's box, he's only a few feet behind me as the prosecutor. I recall very clearly that during this trial, while Sandy Charles was in the prisoner's box, his fingernails were very long, and when I was making submissions to the court, Sandy Charles would often groan or moan in a disturbing way, and with his long fingernails, he would scratch the wood of the prisoner's box. It was quite disconcerting to go for days with this behavior just a few feet behind me. I can recall some of the press, even during the break, looking at the prisoner's box to see if this scratching had left marks in the wood, because the scratching and the moaning was quite loud.
After listening to the defense's pleas, Judge Jerry Albright found Sandy Charles not criminally responsible on account of mental disorder. The teen was sent to the North Battleford Psychiatric Center in Saskatchewan.
In 1998, Sandy Charles escaped from the North Battleford Youth Center. He was soon caught and turned back over to the authorities and has since remained institutionalized. He declined an offer to be interviewed by Northern Mysteries. People tend to be fascinated by occult crimes. These types of murders take us beyond the limits of reason, and the motives usually remain a mystery. These crimes only seem to make sense to the murderer himself, whether it be Sandy Charles or Jesus Constanzo.
Despite the complexity of the case, defense lawyer Barry Singer knew that the influence of the media, especially movies, had already been cited in other cases involving strange crimes. He intended to draw a parallel between this case and a series of murders that had happened 6 years earlier in Matamoros. Every spring during March break frenzy, hundreds of college students from Houston, San Antonio, and Austin arrive at this city just south of the border. Mark Kilroy was one of them. On March 15th, 1989, Mark Kilroy, an American student, mysteriously disappeared after an evening out with his friends in Matamoros. Kilroy's friends were the first to warn border officials of his disappearance. On April 9th, 3 weeks after Kilroy disappeared, Officer Juan Benitez of the Mexican Federal Police in Matamoros arrested 4 members of the Hernandez family, a local organization suspected of drug trafficking. The suspect's ranch was located south of Matamoros. Authorities believed that it was being used to store large quantities of marijuana destined for the United States. The 4 members of the Hernandez family were locked up in the Matamoros prison. While they were being questioned, Officer Benitez had a strange feeling. He got the impression that they were hiding something. There was more going on than just drug trafficking. Could they be somehow linked to the disappearance of the student that the American police were looking for? An hour later, Benitez and his men raided the Hernandez family Rancho Santa Elena. In a small building that was giving off a foul stench, the federal agents found a dreadful sight. a huge cast iron kettle stained with dried blood, containing pieces of human brain, a grilled turtle, and a goat's head. And all around it were half-burned black candles. When they saw these objects, the police officers began to murmur, "Brujeria," which means witchcraft. In Matamoros, confronted with what the federal agents had found, the prisoners soon confessed to their crimes.
I didn't kill him, but the one who killed him, they hit him with a machete.
At least 10 people, including Mark Kilroy, had been sacrificed in occult ceremonies presided over by their leader Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo, nicknamed El Padrino, the Godfather.
A murderer, an assassin, a thief, a rapist. What they all have in common is that they are using a human being for their own aims. Power, force, megalomania, total control. The other, the human being, ceases to be a person. It no longer has the characteristics of a person. It's reduced to being an object whose sole purpose is to satisfy the murderer's compulsions.
As well as his dealings with the Mexican underworld, Constanzo, a 25-year-old Cuban, also had the reputation of being a warlock. His men even said that he had supernatural powers. Obsessed with the film The Believers, Constanzo gradually persuaded his followers to join in his occult beliefs, which were partly based on the movie. According to El Padrino, the murder rituals were supposed to protect him and his buddies from their enemies and the police. They would be invincible.
You must have something that I would call a psychological flaw. Or in other words, something that is lacking on the psychological level, that lets you be influenced by acts of violence on TV or in the movies. A flaw that could lead an individual to commit or desire to commit a crime or an aggressive act. Without this predisposition, without this structural flaw on the psychological level, scenes of violence on the television will only frighten us, maybe excite us a little, but nothing more. They just don't trigger any desire in us whatsoever to emulate the perpetrator.
Sandy Charles likely did not know at the time he was doing something wrong and was psychotic, suffering from delusions when the murder took place.
Sandy Charles and Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo both came from communities that traditionally attached tremendous importance to the magical powers of the supernatural world. Culture might well have played a role in their tragic destiny.
I honestly believe that the media, to a great extent, pushed the racial issue or increased the tension over the racial issue at the time when they were up reporting on this. But that was a continuing element that we had to deal with during our investigation, that there was a lot of issues over the fact that Jonathan Timpson was a young Native boy, and that the police, it was suggested that the police weren't taking this serious.
Sandy Charles was sent to the forensic hospital in North Battleford. From there, Sandy Charles escaped. When he escaped, he crossed the river. He crossed the Saskatchewan River. A fairly large manhunt was undertaken to locate Sandy Charles. I was notified immediately after he escaped. When he escaped, I happened to be at my son's piano teacher's house. And my son's piano teacher lived on Sinot Crescent. And when I was told that Sandy Charles had escaped, I looked out the window and I saw 20 to 30 children playing outside. It was frightening. Sandy Charles was captured the very next day and is now incarcerated at the Regional Psychiatric Center in Saskatoon.
Sandy Charles and Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo belong to this special class of secret assassins, killers whose crimes are motivated by a quest for magical powers. For reasons unknown, these horrifying atrocities fascinate the public. Could it be that these crimes reverberate in the depths of our souls? Whether it's someone praying at the foot of a statue of Christ, offering milk to Ganesh, or sacrificing a child in Satan's name, the fundamental question remains the same. Can we really communicate with the gods? Can our actions inspire the gods to answer our prayers?
In the case of the crimes committed by Matamoros, or the murder committed by Sandy Charles, people often accused the media, television, and movies of having played a key role in the atrocities. The way that media make violence seem so commonplace nowadays tends to minimize the horror of the crimes. How many more cases like Sandy Charles will it take before we do something about it?
Since the beginning of time, humankind has sensed the existence of mysterious forces. For some, these forces express manifestations of the divine. On the contrary, for others, these mysterious powers reveal an unknown aspect of the very nature of man, which can only be perceived using our sixth sense.
I'm Kenneth Welsh, and this is Northern Mysteries. History is teeming with stories of epic adventures that are cut short and heroes that disappear. In the early part of the 20th century, people would see crazy men flying overhead in a plane. These thrill seekers were forerunners in the conquest of the skies. It was the era of the Wright brothers, Zeppelins, and Charles Lindbergh. It was also the era of l'oiseau blanc, otherwise known as the white bird.
May 8th, 1927, a magnificent biplane is pushed out of its hangar at the Bourget airfield just outside of Paris. Hundreds of curious onlookers are gathered to celebrate as Charles Nungesser and Francois Colli take off. They will be the first aviators to attempt a non-stop flight across the Atlantic Ocean. After consulting the latest weather reports and shaking hands with a few close friends, the two pilots take off, headed for America. A few minutes later, they jettison the landing gear to lighten the load. Nungesser and Colli are ready to make history. But the script won't go quite as planned. In early 1927, several aviators were in a race against the clock. They all wanted to be the first to fly non-stop across the Atlantic so that they could win the $20,000 Orteig Award. The French team of François Colli and Charles Nungesser were the first to attempt the feat in the spring of that year.
Charles Nungesser was probably one of the most famous French pilots of World War I. He was credited with 45 aircraft kills, and unofficially they have 107 to his credit.
Each time that Charles Nungesser flew a plane, he made sure that it bore his insignia, a gruesome design bearing a coffin and skull set in a black heart.
Someone asked him what it meant, and he explained the English translation of what he said is that the valiant heart does not fear death even in its most terrible aspect. And that is a pretty good description of his character.
Charles Nungesser's courage and recklessness made him a likely candidate to accomplish this feat. He had no time to lose. On the other side of the Atlantic, American Charles Lindbergh was close at his heels. Nungesser decided to join forces with François Colli to take on this challenge.
François Colli, the one-eyed devil, they once called him, although he was a very nice man. There was nothing devilish about him. He had lost an eye during the war and wore a black monocle. He was a fabulous navigator and absolutely fearless.
Decorated with a military cross and appointed as an officer in the Legion of Honor, Colli ended World War I as a squadron captain. In 1919, he flew a round trip across the Mediterranean Sea and set a new record for the longest distance flown in a straight line. Before attempting to fly non-stop across the Atlantic, Nungesser and Colli had to find the best aircraft available to help them achieve their goal. Nicknamed Oiseau Blanc, the aircraft had to be adapted for such a long flight.
The airplane Nungesser and Colli selected for their flight to New York was a French military design that was intended for use from aircraft carriers, and it was very ingenious. The idea was that if the airplane got caught out away from the aircraft carrier, they could drop their landing gear, and the bottom of the airplane was designed like a boat so that they could land on the water, then the ship could come and pick them up.
They found that if they jettisoned the landing gear once they were airborne, the weight of the aircraft was considerably reduced, which was an important factor given the size of the biplane.
It was a very large airplane. As I recall, about a 55-foot wingspan, 30-some-odd foot length, carried over 1,000 gallons of gasoline. When they took off for New York in this aircraft, it was the first time that anyone had gotten an airplane off the ground with enough fuel to, in theory, fly nonstop across the Atlantic. And everyone expected that they would make it.
Finally, on May 8, 1927, the two aviators took off in the Oiseau Blanc as planned. The two French pilots were literally isolated from the rest of the world. To lighten their load as much as possible, they chose not to bring along a radio, which seemed to be a rather rash decision given the circumstances. To find their way, they basically had to rely on their own experience and the rudimentary instruments on board the aircraft. In theory, the plan was simple. They were supposed to head towards the southern tip of Ireland, then veer west towards Newfoundland. Then, once the coastline was in sight, they were to turn south and head for New York. A simple plan, in theory.
What we know for sure about the trip that they made across the Atlantic, at least partial trip, was that they were accompanied by French military aircraft as far as the French coast.
We have actual sightings of the plane on the ocean by a British submarine. And we actually have a report that was done by the British submarine saying that the plane was sighted. And it gave, saying that the plane had blue, white, and red markings on the tail. and it had the rondelles on the upper wings or bottom wings, and it had the black heart on the side of it.
The next day, despite the inclement weather, a crowd gathered and waited impatiently for the arrival of the Oiseau Blanc. New York Harbor was filled with boats, and everyone was wondering what had happened to Nungesser and Coley.
An airplane was reported to be seen over Newfoundland, and then Nova Scotia, and then the coast of New England near Boston. And everyone expected the airplane to arrive at any moment.
Jumping the gun, a Montreal daily newspaper, La Presse, announced that the pilots had ended their cross-Atlantic flight by landing at 5 p.m. In France, the entire country celebrated with joy. The aviator's trek made the headlines in all the newspapers. But it was soon discovered that the news was false. The plane flown by the two French pilots had never landed in New York. The country's euphoria quickly changed to concern. By May 11th, Nungesser and Coley were still missing. Everyone feared the worst. Their fuel reserves had to have run out by now. Searches were conducted, but the pilots were never found. In 1984, an archaeological group dedicated to recovering historical aircraft launched the Midnight Ghost Project. They carried out an investigation to find the missing aircraft belonging to Nungesser and Coley. Led by Richard Gillespie, who had an interest in both history and aviation, the group checked into all of the rumors relating to locations where the Oiseau Blanc might have landed. Their investigations led them to the woods of Maine, where rumor had it that the two French pilots had spent their last moments.
We looked for the white bird in the state of Maine for 8 years, 20 expeditions. It was brutal. But in the end, what we found was that all there were stories, very good stories, people who remembered this and remembered that from the old days. And little bits and pieces of things out in the woods that we couldn't identify, but might be from an airplane.
To make their job even more difficult, the group found pieces of other aircraft along the way that had no connection whatsoever with the plane flown by Nungesser and Coley. In 1992, their investigations turned to Newfoundland's Avalon Peninsula. According to reports, a plane was seen in the sky over Newfoundland the day after Nungesser and Coley departed for New York.
We have documents from that time of local people who have gone to the local magistrate and said, I know that you wouldn't believe me otherwise, but I'll swear to this. And here we have this official document sworn before a magistrate. Much better than just a story reported by a newspaper. The interesting thing about these accounts are that when you put them together, they happen in sequence down along the coast of Newfoundland.
With the help of sophisticated equipment, Richard Gillespie was able to determine that an aircraft had indeed crashed near Gull Pond in the heart of the Cape Shore marshes in the Avalon Peninsula. Unfortunately, none of the debris found in the area was officially identified as having originated from the Oiseau Blanc. Richard Gillespie and his group are not the only ones who believe that the plane crashed in Newfoundland. William Nungesser, a cousin of the famous pilot, believes it as well. He thinks that a more thorough investigation would help to shed light on the mystery surrounding the last few moments of Nungesser and Coley's lives.
You know, the plane being a seaplane that was supposed to land in the sea, well, Newfoundland has a lot of these things called glacial ponds. And they're not really super deep. I mean, they may be 10 feet deep at the most. And being that my cousin only had no landing gear on the plane, it only could land in water. And if they were having, distress or anything with the aircraft, they would land in one of these little glacial ponds and stuff. One of the reports coming out of Newfoundland that a man saw the aircraft, said the plane looked like it was in distress, that there was either smoke or steam coming from the aircraft. So that's why the story coming out of Newfoundland is very interesting, because if the man sees the plane under distress, it might not have much further to fly. My cousin's going to be looking for a place to put the plane down.
Does the answer to one of the greatest aviation mysteries of all time lie buried in a Newfoundland marsh? Did Francois Colli and Charles Nungesser die on Canadian soil, far from their homeland? As they took off from Bourget that cold morning in May 1927, Francois Colli and Charles Nungesser hoped to make a name for themselves in aviation history. They ended up leaving the path wide open for American Charles Lindbergh, who succeeded in crossing the Atlantic just a few days after their unsuccessful attempt.
The disappearance of Nungesser and Colli's plane is one of the greatest mysteries in history. What happened on board Oiseau Blanc? Did the two French pilots really make it to Canada, as some believe, or did they simply crash into the ocean? While some think that the discovery of the wreckage solves the mystery, as far as their disappearance is concerned, history serves as a reminder that mysteries are sometimes so complex that what appears to be the answer is in reality where the questions begin. It is reasonable to think that Nungesser and Colli's disappearance was due to a mechanical failure. But what if archaeologists suddenly told us that they discovered Oiseau Blanc in the middle of the forest in perfect working order? We would no doubt be amazed, which is probably exactly what the crew of the Dei Gratia felt when they boarded another of history's great enigmas, the Mary Celeste.
On December 4th, 1872, about 1,000 kilometers off the coast of Spain, sailing under the Canadian flag, the Dei Gratia came upon the brigantine Mary Celeste.
Captain, there's a ship in trouble coming our way. Mr. Lebeau, go with you.
Observed from the Dei Gratia, the Mary Celeste seemed to be in distress. No one was on the bridge. It appeared to be abandoned.
The Mary Celeste, originally named Amazon, was built just a few feet from where we're sitting right now. She was launched in 1861. She had a long career as a wooden vessel, 24 years. And she was a bad luck vessel from the day she was launched until she was deliberately wrecked. The day she was launched, my grandfather was on her. The captain was a young man from near Five Islands, economy, and he was sick. They loaded their lumber and they set off for England, but they didn't get out of the Bay of Fundy when the captain became very ill. So they turned the vessel around, they came back to Spencer's Island, where he died a few hours later. That was the first incident of the Mary Celeste. She lost other captains during her career. She never made a cent for anybody. She was just, well, some called her a hoodoo, a Jonah. In other words, a bad luck vessel.
In 1867, the Amazon ran aground on the rocky coast of Cape Breton. It was put back in the water and led to Spencer Island, where it was completely refurbished. Its length was extended to 31.4 meters, and its weight was now 282 tons.
Her owners were forced to sell her. She was sold to a man in New York, in New York City. He renamed her the Mary Celeste. It is not good luck to change the name of a vessel, but he felt in this case he could perhaps bring good luck because the vessel had been born with such bad luck. He was absolutely wrong. He refitted her and sent her off with 1,700 casks of alcohol headed from Staten Island to Genoa, Italy. They never arrived. They got as far as Gibraltar, and the crew was never seen again.
David Reed Morehouse, the captain of the Dei Gratia, found irony in this chance encounter. Not only was he quite familiar with Benjamin Briggs, the captain of the drifting ship, but just 2 weeks earlier, both ships had been docked in New York at about the same time. An odd coincidence. Morehouse instructed his men to board the Mary Celeste to investigate.
When the crew of Dei Gratia spotted Mary Celeste, they found her one sail set, the other dragging and fluttering in the breeze, hatch covers off, slowly moving her way along. They hailed, and there was no answer. And so as they drew closer, they could see a line trailing over the stern, but no other signs of distress. Nobody was on board. The vessel, abandoned, but with signs of life having been there not too long before, certainly proved to be a mystery.
The Mary Celeste was deserted and had been abandoned for several days, judging by the water in the deckhouse and between decks and the meter of water in the ship's hold. They found 1,700 barrels of crude alcohol and a 6-month supply of food and water in the hold.
The description that this crew member gave was that it looked as if people had just disappeared. There were materials left out. There was a full store of food available. The captain's wife's harmonium was out and looking as if it was about to be played, and yet there was not a soul on the ship.
The cabin aft was wet. The crew's belongings, many of them in place, but in disarray. The captain's instruments and the log gone, but with the log slate indicating a last entry of November 25th, a little better than a week earlier.
The ghost ship was returned to its New York owners with no explanation given for the ship having been abandoned. The Mary Celeste continued to sail around the world, drawing curious onlookers wherever it docked.
I guess all the blank spaces would be filled with all sorts of imaginings, to mutiny, to sea creatures, to supernatural happenings. All of these things combined to give Mary Celeste a bad name that would persist right up to the end when she was wrecked by her last captain and crew in a deliberate act of barratry.
On November 2nd, 2000, a Canadian television crew finally discovered the remains of the Mary Celeste off the coast of Haiti. But the ship did not provide them with any answers to one of the greatest mysteries in marine history.
Certainly, we didn't find anything that added anything more to an understanding of what happened out there in the North Atlantic in 1872. As to my opinion, I have one like so many other people. I believe that Mary Celeste was abandoned by captain and crew in a moment of panic.
The captain of the Mary Celeste was a man named Benjamin Briggs. He was a teetotaler and kind of a Bible thumper. He was a very religious man. He had on board alcohol, which he had no experience with at all. He also had his wife and his 2-year-old daughter. At some point, I suspect that the alcohol began to leak and the fumes from the alcohol started to come up through the ship, and I think he panicked. He put over their 17-foot lifeboat. I think the crew and he and his wife entered it, and somehow a storm came up, the line parted, and they simply lost their vessel.
Whatever happened was tragic. Whatever happened actually is commonplace. There are still hundreds of vessels each year that go missing without a trace. And there are ships that are still found adrift with nary a soul aboard. The ocean is vast, its secrets are many, and most of them will never be told, at least not until Judgment Day.
The names L'Oiseau Blanc and the Mary Celeste are both synonymous with mystery and intrigue. Did Nungesser and Colley crash into a swamp in Newfoundland? Did the crew of the Mary Celeste abandon ship without giving a thought to the consequences of their actions? L'Oiseau Blanc and the Mary Celeste remind us that not knowing the facts behind an event can often give birth to a fascinating mystery.
Fantastic encounters, enigmatic disappearances, and fabulous legends. Maybe someone can finally reveal the truth behind these mysteries, and maybe that someone is you.